Welcome to Cozy Sleep Haven. Wind down, cuddle up, and let's get cozy. Welcome back to the charming coastal town of Havenport, where the waves gently lap against the shore, and the lighthouse stands tall as a steadfast guardian of the night. This is a place where familiar faces, quiet streets, and the beauty of nature create a haven for reflection and peace. In Havenport, you'll find Grace, a meditation guide, and the heart of this cozy community. Grace runs her own little meditation studio here, where locals and visitors alike come to unwind, recharge, and connect with themselves. Today, she's guiding us through a meditation inspired by Havenport's iconic lighthouse, a beacon that has stood the test of time, weathering storms and guiding travelers safely home. In tonight's meditation, Grace draws on the imagery of the lighthouse to help ground you, bringing a sense of stability and warmth. And afterwards, she'll take us on a little journey to the lighthouse itself, where we'll meet Hank, the lighthouse keeper, and share a quiet moment reflecting on resilience and finding one's place in the world. Whether you're here for the first time or returning to the comfort of Havenport, Grace welcomes you to let go of the day's cares and join her on this journey by the shore. Here at Cozy Sleep Haven, we embrace the joy of slowing down. If you enjoy your time with us, please consider subscribing to help support our channel and join our growing community of cozy connoisseurs. We're always here to help you relax, unwind, and drift into peaceful sleep. Now, find a comfortable position, breathe in deeply, and allow Grace's voice to guide you into a state of calm, grounded by the light of Havenport's beloved lighthouse. Welcome. Tonight we'll embark on a peaceful journey together, letting go of the day's weight as we settle into a place of grounding and calm. Imagine yourself standing on a quiet, sandy shore where the vast sea meets the land, stretching into the gentle darkness of the evening. In the distance, you see a lighthouse, a steady, comforting beacon casting its warm, guiding light across the water. As you stand here, feel the cool, solid ground beneath you. Allow your feet to sink into the sand or grass, feeling the firm support of the earth below. With each breath, let yourself connect to this feeling of grounding, safe, steady, held by the strength of the earth. Now, begin to notice the gentle rhythm of the lighthouse's light as it moves across the sea. With each sweep of the light, a sense of calm flows over you, wrapping you in warmth and comfort. Imagine your breath syncing with this rhythm, like the lighthouse's light keeping time with the waves. Take a deep breath in, drawing in a sense of grounding and peace. Feel the fresh, salty air filling your lungs, tearing away any lingering tension or worry. And as you slowly exhale, let go, feeling any weight or heaviness drift away, carried off by the waves. Picture the lighthouse standing tall, strong against the backdrop of the night. Its light shines through the darkness, unwavering, guiding ships and wanderers home. Imagine that light is there for you, a steady presence offering peace and reassurance. As you breathe, let each inhale draw on the lighthouse's warmth, filling you with a steady, comforting glow. And as you exhale, release anything that no longer serves you, letting it dissolve like mist fading away. With each breath, you feel more grounded, more at peace. Just like the lighthouse rooted firmly on the shore, you are strong and steady, capable of weathering any storm. Allow this feeling of grounding to settle within you, a quiet knowing that, like the lighthouse, You can be both gentle and strong, resilient and calm. Let this warmth stay with you as we begin our story, keeping you anchored, connected, and at ease. And now, with the sense of grounding and peace, let us journey together towards the light. As the meditation draws to a close, Grace gently opens her eyes, feeling a renewed sense of calm and grounding from the simple act of visualizing the lighthouse and its steady light. She stands, letting the peaceful energy linger within her, then reaches for her jacket, feeling the familiar weight of the fabric. The evening air outside is cool, carrying a faint hint of salt and pine, and she finds herself naturally drawn toward the lighthouse she had just imagined. The light in the distance sweeps gracefully across the horizon, its glow both a guide and a comfort. Grace steps onto the quiet path leading to the cliff, where the lighthouse stands watch over Havenport. Each step feels purposeful, steady, like her journey to the lighthouse is guided by something deeper. The familiar sounds of the coastal town fade behind her, replaced by the gentle rustling of wind and the occasional call of a distant seabird. In the growing dusk, the lighthouse's glow becomes brighter, warmer, welcoming her closer. Grace smiles, feeling as if she's walking toward an old friend. And in a way she is. The lighthouse has always been a source of peace, its quiet strength a reminder of resilience. Tonight, she knows she'll find comfort not only in the light, but in the company of Hank, Havenport's steadfast lighthouse keeper, whose wisdom has always guided her in gentle, unexpected ways. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint, briny scent of the sea as Grace approached the lighthouse. Against the dusky sky, the tower stood tall and unwavering, its familiar red and white stripes illuminated by the warm light circling above. The soft beam swept slowly over the landscape, casting gentle shadows across the cliffs and the water below. Grace's steps were quiet as she followed the winding path up to the lighthouse. Around her, the only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the distant murmur of waves rolling onto the shore. The sight of the lighthouse filled her with a sense of calm. It was a place she'd come to know well, a beacon of peace and stability, always there, guiding and grounding. As she neared the base of the lighthouse, she glanced up at the lantern room where the light continued its rhythmic arc. It was as if the lighthouse itself were breathing, each sweep a steady, comforting reminder of resilience. The door creaked slightly as Grace entered the tower, the familiar smell of salt and oil greeting her. The interior was simple and well kept, with smooth stone steps leading up to the lantern room. Small beams of light filtered down, giving the narrow stairwell an ethereal glow, almost as if the lighthouse were welcoming her home. Taking a deep breath, she started up the spiral staircase. The quiet sounds of her footsteps and the faint hum of the light filled the space, lending a peaceful rhythm to her ascent. When she reached the top, Grace found Hank, the lighthouse keeper, carefully tending to the lantern. The light cast a warm, golden glow around him, illuminating his weathered features and steady hands. Dressed in his familiar fisherman's sweater, Hank looked every bit a part of the lighthouse. Solid, unwavering, timeless. He looked up and gave her a welcoming smile. "Evening, Grace," he greeted her in his deep, calm voice, with a hint of a smile that spoke of years of gentle wisdom. "Come to check on the old lighthouse?" Grace returned his smile and stepped closer, glancing around the lantern room. "Couldn't resist the pull," she replied softly, letting her gaze linger on the bright, polished lantern. "I've always found a kind of peace here." Hank nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth as he stepped back to admire his work. "There's something about it, isn't there? Always standing strong, always shining, no matter the storm." Grace looked around the room, the comforting warmth of the light reflecting in her eyes. The lighthouse was old but well cared for, each part meticulously maintained, its walls a silent testament to resilience. She let her gaze fall on the lantern itself, watching the steady light as it continued its arc, a gentle, grounding presence in the darkening night. Hank's voice broke the silence. "It's been through a lot, this old light. Storm, salt, wear and tear, but it's still here, still standing." He ran a hand over the railing, as if connecting with the lighthouse on a deeper level. His expression one of quiet reverence. Grace nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She looked back at Hank, appreciating his calm presence, the way he embodied the lighthouse's spirit of resilience. In many ways, he was as much a part of this place as the stones and beams that held it up. "Sometimes," Hank continued, "I think we're all a bit like this lighthouse. We take the storms, the changes, but we keep shining, keep standing." The two of them stood in comfortable silence, the soft light casting their shadows along the walls. Grace could feel the quiet strength of the lighthouse wrapping around them, grounding her in the moment, steady and sure. For a few moments, they simply watched the light's gentle sweep over the horizon, each lost in thought, feeling the presence of something timeless and steadfast. As Grace climbed the last few steps of the narrow, winding staircase, the faint smell of salt and old wood filled the air. At the top, she found Hank, the lighthouse keeper, polishing the great glass lens that would soon send its beam far over the ocean. The room was filled with a soft glow. Even as the light from the setting sun poured through the small windows, casting warm, amber rays across the walls. Hank turned, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his weathered face as he saw her. His eyes, as blue and deep as the sea itself, sparkled with warmth. He motioned for her to come closer, his voice gentle but steady. "Well, Grace," he began, in that comforting tone of his, "it's not every day we get a visitor up here. You've come at a fine time, just before the light turns on for the evening. There's a peace to it, isn't there?" Grace nodded, feeling a quiet reverence in the presence of both Hank and the lighthouse itself. She'd always loved hearing him talk about the history of this place, how it had watched over Havenport for generations, its light a constant reminder of home to those at sea. Hank continued, looking out through the glass and over the vast expanse of water. This lighthouse was built over 150 years ago. Can you imagine? It was just after a terrible storm swept through the coast, one that folks still talk about in whispers. Ships lost, lives taken, and families left, waiting for those who never returned. He paused, his eyes clouding for a moment, before he shook his head, almost as if clearing away a lingering sadness. The people of Havenport were determined not to let that happen again. So the townsfolk gathered. Fishermen, carpenters, shipbuilders, all lending a hand to build this beacon. Back then, it was nothing but sheer cliffs, the wind howling and the sea crashing against the rocks. They built it stone by stone with grit and love and a whole lot of heart. Grace listened, captivated as Hank's voice softened. Back in those days, it wasn't easy to keep a lighthouse running. They used whale oil to fuel the lamp, and someone had to be here every night, watching, tending to it, no matter the weather. Storm, storms, blizzards, it didn't matter. Someone was always here, keeping the light steady. He reached out, placing his hand gently on the glass lens, almost as if touching an old friend. You see, this light, it's more than just a signal. It's a promise that no matter how dark the night, there's always a way back home. That's what the people of Havenport wanted. A guiding star, something to keep the sailors safe, something to bring them back. Hank's voice trailed off, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the sea below. Grace felt a deep respect welling up inside her for this place, for all the hands that had built it, all the lives it had touched. After a pause, Hank continued, his tone now softer, almost like he was sharing a well-kept secret. And there's more, Grace. You see, this lighthouse has weathered more than just storms. Over the years, it's stood through wars, through changes in the world that people couldn't even imagine back then. But no matter what, the light has never gone out. He glanced over at Grace, his gaze steady. They say that the first keeper, old Jonas Wheeler, was so dedicated that he barely left the tower. Rumor has it he could hear the voices of the sailors in the wind calling to him, asking for his help to guide them home. Some folks say his spirit's still here, watching over the place, making sure the light stays steady. Grace smiled, feeling a shiver run down her spine. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the enduring presence of the lighthouse and the legacy it carried. Hank chuckled, noticing her expression. Oh, don't worry, Grace. If old Jonas is still around, he's just here to make sure things are done right. This place, it's seen more than we'll ever know, and I reckon it's got plenty more stories yet to tell. Hank paused, looking out over the quiet sea, his expression thoughtful, as if he were sifting through memories of long ago. Grace could sense that he was about to dive even deeper into the lighthouse's past, into the very fabric of Havenport itself. Now let me tell you about one of the fiercest storms this lighthouse has ever seen, Hank continued, his voice low and steady, drawing Grace into the story. It was back in the winter of 1908, a night as black as pitch, with waves as tall as the cliffs. The storm rolled in so fast that even the most experienced sailors were caught off guard. He shook his head slowly, the lines on his face deepening with the weight of remembrance. There was a ship out there, a cargo vessel called the Northern Star, trying to make its way home. She was a sturdy ship, built for rough waters, but that night was different. The sea was angry, like it had a mind of its own, thrashing and tearing at the hull. Grace felt herself holding her breath, swept up in the tension of Hank's words. She could almost see the storm, the towering waves, the desperate struggle of the sailors clinging to their hope of reaching shore. They say, Hank continued, his voice barely above a whisper, that the light from this very tower was the only thing that saved them. Jonas Wheeler was the keeper at the time. He was well into his 70s by then. But he stayed up here all night, never left his post, even as the tower shook from the force of the wind. They say he prayed, steadying himself against the wall, his hand on the lantern, whispering words of comfort as if he was speaking to the sailors directly. Hank's eyes softened, a touch of admiration in his gaze. In the end, the Northern Star found its way to safety, guided by Jonas's light. The townsfolk called him a hero, said he was more lighthouse than man. But you know, Grace, he added, glancing over at her, I don't think he thought of himself as a hero. He just knew he had a job to do, a promise to keep, even if it meant standing against the storm. Grace felt a deep warmth spreading in her chest, a sense of respect and gratitude, not just for Jonas, but for Hank himself. She realized that he too was part of this legacy, a modern-day guardian of Havenport's history, holding the torch that Jonas and the others had carried before him. Hank cleared his throat, perhaps feeling the weight of the tale himself, and moved to wipe a faint smudge off the glass lens. "You know, Grace," he said quietly, "there's something about this lighthouse. It's more than bricks and mortar, more than gears and glass. It's like a living thing, a friend to those out on the sea, a companion to those who feel lost." He looked over at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "And sometimes it's a guide for those of us here on land too. Reminds us of where we're going, and that there's always a way forward, even when the path gets dark." The room fell silent, and for a moment they both stood quietly, gazing out over the sea. The light from the lantern filled the tower with a soft glow, casting shadows that danced gently along the walls. After a moment, Hank spoke again, his tone lighter now, bringing them back to the present. "So, Grace, I hope that wasn't too much of a history lesson for you," he said with a wink. "But I figured it's worth knowing the stories of those who came before. After all, each one of us here in Havenport, we're all part of this place, just like Jonas, just like the sailors who found their way home." Grace smiled, her heart warmed by Hank's words. She realized that, in a way, this lighthouse and Hank himself were helping her find her own path, illuminating the way forward, even in the smallest moments. As they turned to leave, Hank glanced back at the lighthouse lens, his face softened by a deep respect. He gave it one last gentle pat, as if saying goodbye to an old friend, before he and Grace made their way back down the winding stairs, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone walls. In that quiet descent, Grace felt a sense of clarity and calm settle over her, as if the lighthouse itself had granted her a new perspective, a grounding, a reminder of resilience, and the simple, powerful comfort of a light that never wavers. As they stepped outside the lighthouse, Grace felt the coolness of the evening air wrap around her. The sky was a deepening shade of violet, with hints of amber and rose lingering on the horizon where the sun had dipped below the water's edge. A gentle breeze rolled in from the sea, carrying the faint scent of salt and wild grasses, brushing against her cheeks and stirring the tall beach grass that grew along the rocky cliffs. Hank moved alongside her, his stride steady and sure. She noticed the way he took in every detail of his surroundings, the shifting clouds, the distant calls of seabirds settling down for the night, the soft crash of the waves far below. It was clear to Grace that Hank was as much a part of this landscape as the lighthouse itself, a man shaped by the rhythms and mysteries of the sea. They walked in a comfortable silence, letting the quiet sounds of the cliffs fill the space between them. Grace could feel the tranquility of the moment seeping into her, grounding her as they moved along the narrow path that wound around the cliffs. The pathway was rugged and uneven, dotted with patches of soft moss and small weathered stones that had been scattered by years of coastal winds. Each step brought with it a sense of reverence for the land, a feeling that every inch of this place held a story. They paused at a natural outcropping where the land jutted out slightly over the edge of the cliff. From here, Grace could see the sweeping view of Havenport below, the town's twinkling lights beginning to flicker on as night approached. The homes and shops looked like miniature stars scattered across the hillside, each one a warm and familiar beacon in the growing darkness. It was a breathtaking view, and for a moment, she stood in quiet awe, simply taking it all in. Hank followed her gaze, a soft smile playing on his face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've walked this path 1,000 times, and still, every evening, it feels like I'm seeing it for the first time." Grace nodded, letting his words wash over her. There was a timelessness here, a sense that this place had seen countless sunrises and sunsets, each one unique yet woven into the fabric of Havenport's history. She felt grateful to be a small part of it, if only for this moment. Hank gestured down toward the shoreline, where waves lapped gently against the rocks. "You know," he began, his voice reflective, "my father used to bring me up here when I was a boy. We'd sit on these very cliffs, watching the ships go by. He'd tell me stories about the ocean, about the creatures that lived below the surface, and the ships that sailed across its waters. He always said that the sea has a language of its own, a language only the lighthouse truly understands." Grace turned to him, intrigued. "Did he work at the lighthouse too?" she asked softly. Hank nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "Aye, he did, and his father before him. The lighthouse has been in our family for generations. I grew up with it in my blood, you could say." He chuckled, a hint of pride shining in his gaze. "I'd be down on the beach, watching the waves, dreaming of far-off places, but I always knew I'd end up here, just like my father and grandfather." The air grew still, as if holding space for the weight of Hank's words. Grace could see how deeply he was connected to this place, how it had shaped his life and woven its way into his heart. She realized that, for Hank, the lighthouse was more than just a job. It was a legacy, a purpose, a beacon not just for ships at sea, but for himself as well. They continued along the path, the sound of their footsteps soft against the packed earth. Hank reached out and gently touched a twisted, weathered tree that clung to the edge of the cliff, its branches bending toward the sea. "This old tree," he said with a fond smile, "has been here for as long as I can remember. Survived storm after storm, still standing strong. Reminds me of the lighthouse in a way. Just there, holding its ground, weathering whatever comes its way." Grace studied the tree, its bark rough and gnarled, its branches reaching out like arms that had seen the world and embraced it all the same. There was something powerful in that resilience, a quiet strength that mirrored the steadfast light from the tower behind them. She felt a newfound respect for the landscape, for the people like Hank who had devoted their lives to caring for it. They paused again, and Grace took a deep breath, savoring the cool, crisp air that filled her lungs. The sky was darker now, the stars beginning to peek through, casting a soft glow over the cliffs. In the distance, the lighthouse's beams swept across the water, a reassuring presence against the darkening horizon. Hank looked out over the water, his face contemplative, his gaze fixed on the distant waves. "Sometimes I wonder what it's all for," he murmured, almost to himself. "All those years, all those nights spent up in the tower, keeping that light burning. It can feel like a lonely task at times." But then he trailed off, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then I remember the sailors, the ones who found their way home because of that light." Grace felt a surge of warmth in her chest, a feeling of kinship with Hank and his quiet dedication. She realized that the lighthouse was more than just a building. It was a symbol of hope, of resilience, of finding one's way in the dark. They stood in silence, letting the weight of Hank's words settle around them. The world felt still, peaceful, as if it were holding its breath in reverence for the stories, the memories, the legacy of this place. And then, after a long, quiet moment, Hank turned to Grace, his eyes reflecting the soft light from the town below. "Shall we keep walking?" he asked, his voice gentle but steady. Grace nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace settle within her as they continued along the cliffside path, the lighthouse's beam guiding them forward into the night. As Grace and Hank walked further along the cliff path, the air grew even cooler, carrying with it the briny scent of the sea and a faint, earthy undertone from the rocks and damp grass. The path narrowed slightly, winding between patches of wild sage and tiny purple flowers that clung resiliently to the rocky soil, even as winter's chill approached. The quiet beauty of the cliffside was almost overwhelming, each element harmonizing with the next to create a place that felt untouched by time. Hank slowed his pace, and Grace matched his step, sensing that he had more stories to share. He paused beside a weather-beaten bench, carved from driftwood and worn smooth by the elements. He ran his hand over the surface, his eyes distant as memories filled his gaze. "I remember when this bench was built," he said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. "My father and I put it here when I was just a boy. We spent the whole day gathering pieces of driftwood from the shore, sanding them down, fitting them together just right. He said it was important to have a place to sit and take in the view. A lighthouse keeper should always be mindful of the world he's watching over, he told me." Grace took a seat on the bench, feeling the rough but sturdy wood beneath her hands, and looked out over the ocean. The horizon was fading into night, the line between sea and sky growing faint as stars began to emerge. There was something humbling about sitting here, knowing that generations of lighthouse keepers had looked out over the same view, keeping watch over the coastline, their lives intertwined with the ebb and flow of the tides. Hank remained standing, his hands in his pockets as he looked out over the cliffs. "The lighthouse, it's seen so much, you know. Not just storms and shipwrecks, though there have been plenty of those. But it's also been there for moments of quiet joy, little celebrations and farewells." He chuckled, shaking his head. There was a time back in the early 1900s when people would gather here for picnics on Sunday afternoons. They'd spread blankets right here on the cliffs, children running around while their parents watched the ships pass by. Grace imagined the scene. A small community gathered on a summer's day, laughter and chatter filling the air as families enjoyed the simplicity of life by the sea. It was a peaceful image, and she could almost hear the echoes of those distant voices mingling with the sound of the waves. Hank continued, his tone shifting as he grew more reflective. "In winter, it's quieter, but there's a beauty in that too. I've always thought there's something magical about a snow-covered lighthouse. When the world turns white and the only sound is the faint crackle of ice on the waves, it's like stepping into a dream. Everything feels still, yet alive." Grace nodded, captivated by his words. She could picture it, the lighthouse standing tall against a blanket of snow, its warm light cutting through the wintry dusk, casting long shadows over the cliffs. It was a place of contrast, of strength and solitude, standing guard over the quiet town below. Hank looked down, his eyes softened with nostalgia. "My father used to say that the lighthouse is more than just a beacon for ships. It's a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, there's always a light to guide you home, a steady, unwavering presence, standing strong through all the storms." Grace felt a lump form in her throat, touched by the weight of Hank's words. She realized that the lighthouse was, in many ways, a reflection of Hank himself, a man shaped by resilience, by a quiet devotion to his role, carrying on a legacy that went beyond just tending to a light. As they sat together, the silence between them grew deep, not empty, but filled with an unspoken understanding. The lighthouse's beams swept across the cliffs, casting brief shadows that danced over the path before disappearing into the night. In that moment, Grace felt connected to something much larger than herself, something timeless and grounding. After a while, Hank broke the silence, his voice a soft murmur. "You know, Grace, there's a part of me that wonders what will happen when I'm gone. Who will take up this duty? Who will care for the lighthouse, for the cliffs, for this little town we call home?" Grace looked up at him, her expression warm and reassuring. "Someone will, Hank," she said gently. "Someone who understands the importance of what you do, who feels the same connection to this place, just as you followed in your father's footsteps. Someone will carry on your legacy. It's a part of this town's story." Hank gave a small nod, his eyes filled with gratitude and acceptance. "I suppose you're right. I suppose that's how it's always been." They lingered on the cliffside, watching as the stars brightened in the deepening sky. The town of Havenport glowed softly in the distance, each light a reminder of the lives it held, the stories woven together like threads in a tapestry. And at the heart of it all was the lighthouse, a steady, enduring light in the night, a symbol of resilience and hope, standing as a guardian over the sea. After a time, Hank turned to Grace, a gentle smile on his face. "Thank you, Grace, for listening, for caring." Grace smiled back, her heart full. "Thank you, Hank, for sharing these stories and for being here for all of us." They rose from the bench and began the walk back toward the lighthouse, their footsteps quiet against the rocky path, moving together under the vast, starlit sky. The beam of light continued its steady rhythm, a reminder of the constancy that lay within the heart of Havenport, a constancy that would endure long after they were gone. Grace and Hank began their slow walk back from the cliffs, the lighthouse's steady beam casting its light across the path as they made their way toward the town below. The first stars had emerged, glittering softly against the deepening twilight sky, their light mingling with the golden glow of Havenport in the distance. The air felt crisper now, the scent of pine mingling with the salt of the sea, a familiar comfort that seemed to settle into Grace's bones as they walked. Around them, the landscape grew shadowed, yet the soft outlines of rocks, twisted trees, and grass dusted with evening dew added a certain magic to the scene, as if the land itself held stories in its silent watch over the shore. Hank walked beside her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed ahead, as if lost in thought. Grace noticed how his steps fell in rhythm with the gentle sweep of the lighthouse beam, a pattern born from years of familiarity. She had known Hank for years now, but in this quiet, almost reverent moment, she felt she was seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just the keeper of the lighthouse, but a keeper of Havenport's soul. They walked a few more paces before Grace spoke, her voice low. "Hank, do you ever think about what Havenport would be like without the lighthouse?" Hank glanced at her, his expression thoughtful, a glint of emotion in his steady blue eyes. I don't think Havenport would be quite the same," he replied. "That light has guided sailors, travelers, and lost souls for generations. It's been more than a beacon. It's a promise to those out on the water that there's always a way home." He looked away, his gaze scanning the darkening sea. "I think that's part of why I stay, why I couldn't imagine leaving, even for all the places I once dreamed of seeing. This lighthouse and I, we've got an understanding." His voice softened, as if he were sharing something sacred. It's not just bricks and beams, it's a living presence. A part of me, and a part of Havenport too. Grace felt a swell of respect for Hank, for the life he had chosen, for the years he had spent in quiet dedication to something greater than himself. They continued down the path, and as they walked, Grace spotted a small, overgrown garden tucked between two rocky outcroppings along the trail. It was filled with wildflowers that had begun to wilt in the chill of early winter, but their faded petals and twisted vines seemed to hold a quiet beauty. "Didn't you and your father plant that?" she asked, pointing toward the little garden. Hank followed her gaze and nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "We did. My father had this notion that the lighthouse needed something green nearby. Something alive. Said it kept the place feeling balanced, somehow." He chuckled softly. "Of course he had me pulling weeds and lugging buckets of seawater up here all summer to keep it growing. It wasn't easy. But I suppose he was right. There's something comforting about it, even now." He stooped down, brushing his hand over a patch of wild lavender that had somehow held onto its color, despite the chill. "He taught me a lot, my father. About the land, the sea, how everything here is connected in ways we can't always see." He'd say, "A man doesn't need to look far to find meaning, Hank. Sometimes it's right here underfoot." They both stood in silence, feeling the truth in those words as the waves murmured softly below them. Grace imagined Hank as a young boy, his father by his side, learning not just about the lighthouse, but about the deeper rhythm of life along the coast. She could see how those teachings had shaped him, rooted him to this place like the sturdy rocks that lined the cliffside. After a moment, Hank straightened, his gaze drifting back toward the lighthouse behind them. "You know, Grace, sometimes I think my father never really left this place. It's as if his spirit is here, in the stones, in the light itself." He paused, glancing over at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's comfort in that, knowing he's still a part of it all." Grace placed a gentle hand on his arm, offering a quiet reassurance. "And you, Hank, you're a part of it too, just like him. You've given so much to this place, to all of us here in Havenport." Hank looked at her, gratitude softening the lines of his face. "I suppose that's all any of us can hope for. To leave something behind that matters." His gaze grew distant, a peaceful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he looked out over the quiet town below. As Grace and Hank continued their slow walk down the cliff path, the lights of Havenport glowed brighter against the deepening twilight. It was a comforting sight, windows filled with golden light, casting warm patches onto the cool, shadowed streets below. The faint sounds of laughter and distant music drifted up from the town, blending seamlessly with the hush of the waves against the shore. They reached a gentle curve in the path where the cliffside leveled out, giving them a view of Havenport from above. Grace could see the familiar rooftops of the small shops and homes, each one aglow, its windows and doorways framed in soft light. The town looked like something out of a painting, the glow from each building blending together in a tapestry of warmth and life. Hank paused, his gaze lingering on the view below. He took a deep breath, as if he were drawing the whole scene into his memory, holding it close. "There's something special about seeing the town like this," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "From up here, you see how every light, every home, every life is connected. It's like every one of those lights is part of a bigger picture." Grace nodded, moved by his words. There was a sense of unity in that view, a feeling that every person in Havenport played a role in creating the warmth and resilience that defined the town. It was a reminder that even in their quiet lives, their small acts of kindness and care, they were part of something enduring. They resumed walking, the path growing narrower and winding through patches of low, wind-twisted trees. Shadows played between the branches, casting delicate patterns on the ground beneath their feet. Grace reached out, brushing her fingers along a branch, feeling the cool texture of the bark, the way it curved naturally toward the light of the lighthouse behind them. Hank continued his story, his voice a gentle murmur against the evening air. You know, when I was young, I used to wonder what it would be like to leave Havenport, to see the world beyond these cliffs and this ocean. He chuckled a little ruefully. I had dreams, wild ones. Thought I'd become a sailor, maybe travel to far-off lands like my grandfather used to talk about. Grace glanced over at him, imagining a young Hank with those dreams of adventure, his eyes filled with the possibilities of the unknown. It was a side of him she hadn't heard about before, a glimpse into the heart of a man who had chosen a life of dedication and quiet service. "So what kept you here?" she asked softly. Hank looked thoughtful, his gaze turning inward. "I think in the end, it was the light. There's something about it, something I can't quite put into words. A kind of magic, maybe. It calls you back, even when you think you're ready to leave." He paused, gazing out at the town again. "I think that's what this place does. It calls people home, keeps them rooted. Havenport is like the light from the lighthouse, a steady presence, something you can always return to." Grace felt a warmth settle within her at his words. She had often felt that same pull, that sense that Havenport was more than just a place. It was a feeling, a way of being that connected her to the landscape, the people, and the rhythm of life by the sea. And Hank, with his quiet wisdom, his steadfast presence, was as much a part of that feeling as the lighthouse itself. As they drew nearer to the town, the faint sounds of the sea grew softer, blending into the quiet hum of voices, footsteps, and the occasional bark of a dog as people made their way home for the night. The path opened up, revealing the first few houses of Havenport's outer edges, each one glowing with soft lamplight, wreaths already hanging on the doors in anticipation of the holiday season. Hank slowed, glancing over at Grace with a small smile. "Thank you for joining me tonight, Grace. Sometimes I forget how special this place really is, until I see it through someone else's eyes." Grace returned his smile, feeling a deep gratitude for the evening they had shared, for the stories, the memories, the quiet beauty of their walk along the cliffs. "Thank you, Hank, for sharing this place, these memories. They mean more to me than you know." They walked together in companionable silence as they made their way down the last stretch of the path, the lighthouse beam casting one final sweep over the town before it disappeared into the distance. And in that peaceful moment, Grace felt a profound sense of connection to the lighthouse, to Havenport, and to the timeless rhythm of the sea that had shaped this town and the people within it for generations. As the evening deepened, Grace bid Hank farewell, her heart filled with gratitude and quiet reflection. She descended the spiral staircase, the soft hum of the lantern fading behind her, but the warmth of its light lingering within. Stepping outside, she paused, glancing back at the lighthouse as its light swept gracefully across the darkened sea and cliffside. The steady beam illuminated her path, a gentle reminder of resilience and guidance that felt both comforting and empowering. The walk back to town was peaceful, the sounds of the night wrapping around her like a gentle embrace. Grace's thoughts drifted over her conversation with Hank, her heart touched by his words about purpose and the strength in simply shining for others. She felt a sense of calm, knowing that, like the lighthouse, she had her own light to carry, her own way of grounding and guiding. As she reached the edge of town, she took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She felt grounded, connected, and at peace, her mind quiet and her heart steady. In the stillness, she realized that resilience wasn't about never facing storms. It was about staying rooted, keeping a steady light no matter what might come. In that moment, Grace resolved to hold on to this feeling, this sense of purpose and calm, and to share it with others, to be a quiet light for those who might need it, just as Hank and the lighthouse had been for her. With a soft smile, she continued down the path, her steps light, her heart full, the lighthouse's glow a comforting presence behind her. And as she settled into the quiet of the night, she knew that this light, this sense of grounding, would be there, steady and strong, guiding her forward, a beacon of calm for both herself and those around her. Just as the lighthouse stands steady, a light in the darkness, remember that you too have a quiet strength within you. Take a moment to feel grounded, to connect to the peace that's always there, waiting to guide you. Let this gentle light be with you, bringing calm and resilience through each day and night. And know that, like Grace, you can carry this warmth within you, a steady, unwavering light for yourself and for others.